Let's talk about translations. The obvious explanation for translations is going from one language to another language. I am developing an application in an English-speaking environment, but my user base doesn't speak English. They might have a completely different language to use. And I can't use my English labels. I need a mechanism where I can translate those labels to the appropriate language. And I want to do it in such a way that the binding engine can pick up and say, oh, okay, this part needs to be translated for me. That's the simple version of it. There's also other parts to translations where when you're working with dynamic and configurable applications, let's say you have a bunch of work orders that you want to present to people. Some people call it work orders, other people call it job cards. It's still English, but I want to give you the ability to configure the application so that if you use the term job cards instead of work orders, you can do that. You can go and change what these labels are on your application and have it reflect into the UI without having to go and make any changes to the source code itself. Let's go and look at how we defined the translations for this, and we'll take it from there. The first thing that you need to know is that you can add translations to the binding engine using crsbinding.translations.add. You also have other functions in there where you can delete. As you can see within the disconnected callback, I'm removing those translations. And then the second thing that you need to note is that the add takes two parameters. The first parameter is an object literal that defines a structure that we will bind against. And the second parameter is a string context name. Now, in some cases you want to provide the context, and in other cases you don't want to provide the context. So when do I and don't I want to work with the context? In this example, the translations are only valid for this screen. So I am going to have the translations live temporarily. I'm going to want to add them, but then I also want to remove them. And that's where the context becomes important, because the context is the key that is used during the removal of the translations. It is, however, important to note that once you define the context becomes part of the path that you need to define in your binding expressions, as we will see later on. If, however, your translations is application-wide or it's used across many screens and you don't want to add and remove it, you just want to put it in once and then let it live there for the duration of the application, then you can add those items without a context because you don't need to remove them later on. If, however, you decide you want to give it like a global context, that's fine too, you can still do that. This is the HTML where we're putting the translations in, and you'll note that it looks very similar to our stock standard binding if I wanted to put a value inside of a element. We can actually do that, so we can say div and do that, but note the difference in the curly brackets between a normal binding and a translation binding. Yes, they both use curly brackets. Yes, they both use paths. However, the starting character is different. In the normal binding expression, it uses a $, but when I'm binding against a translation, I'm using the @ symbol. The @ symbol indicates to you that this is our translation, and I need you to please put the translation value in this space. Since we are binding against a context, you'll see that our context goes first, then .labels, .firstname. The reason why we have that is because our object literal contains a labels object, and the label object contains our first name, last name, and age. This means that you can structure your translations in a very nice path for you to easily be able to use it. I'm going to remove the context just so you can see the operating without the context quickly. So if I don't want to define a context, I can just omit that parameter completely. And then obviously I want to take the context out of my expressions like that. And now I have binding without the context. Going to my UI and refreshing, you'll see that it still works. There is still more that we can do with translations, but I think I'm going to keep that for separate videos. So please stay tuned for further binding videos on that subject.